One stare ended careers. One single look could make grown men turn their backs and walk away forever. Lee Van Cleef wasn't just an actor. He was a force, a gunslinger who could communicate more with a glance than other men could with 1,000 words. His eyes were weapons. His silence was deafening. And his hatred was absolute. But here's what Hollywood doesn't want you to know. Behind closed doors, Van Cleef was a man at war, with studios, with directors, with actors he considered friends. He collected grudges like ammunition, and he never, ever let them go. This is the story of 6 actors who crossed Lee Van Cleef and paid the price. These weren't minor disputes. These weren't ego clashes between talented men who just didn't see eye to eye. These were blood feuds, betrayals that cut so deep they never healed, friendships that turned to ice, collaborations that became battlegrounds. One of these actors rode to superstardom on Van Cleef's shoulders, then stepped on his neck to climb higher. Another insulted everything Van Cleef had built and paid for it with decades of cold silence. A third got the golden role Van Cleef knew should have been his. By the end of Lee Van Cleef's life, he'd turned his back on some of the most famous names in cinema, and he never looked back. These are the feuds that destroyed friendships, the betrayals that created lifelong enemies, the slights that scarred one of cinema's most intense men and turned him into someone who trusted no one, forgave nothing, and never, ever forgot. Before we dive into the dark side of a Western icon, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss our deep dives into Hollywood's hidden battles. Because the truth behind the legends is always more brutal than the movies. Now let's count down the 6 actors Lee Van Cleef hated most. Number 6. Telly Savalas, the showboat he couldn't stand. Some actors earn respect through their craft. Others demand attention through sheer force of personality. Telly Savalas was the latter, and Lee Van Cleef despised him for it. Their paths crossed in Rome during the mid-1970s, when both were riding the wave of European action films. Van Cleef had built his reputation on restraint, on the power of silence, on letting a single look do the work of 1,000 words. He believed acting was about subtlety, about the space between words, about commanding a room without saying anything at all. Savalas was his opposite, loud, flamboyant, always the center of attention with a cigar in one hand and a joke on his lips. He thrived on audience adoration, on being the life of the party, on making sure everyone knew he was the most interesting person in any given space. The tension ignited on their very first day together. Savalas, ever the performer, decided to mock Lee Van Cleef's trademark squint in front of the entire crew. He narrowed his eyes, puffed his cigar dramatically, and delivered an exaggerated imitation that had half the room laughing. Van Cleef didn't laugh. He stopped mid-stride, locked eyes with Savalas for what felt like an eternity, then turned and walked away without a single word. That silence said everything. From that moment on, production meetings became battlegrounds of presence. Savalas would swagger through the set, cracking jokes and working the room like he was hosting a talk show. Van Cleef remained motionless, statue-like, letting his controlled intensity cut through Savalas's noise like a blade through butter. Crew members later recalled the atmosphere whenever both men occupied the same space. The air itself seemed to vibrate with unspoken hostility. Conversations would die mid-sentence. People would find reasons to be elsewhere. It was like watching 2 alpha predators occupying the same territory, each waiting for the other to move first. Van Cleef made it clear he would never work on another project with Savalas. He told colleagues bluntly that he couldn't tolerate the man. It wasn't professional disagreement, it was visceral distaste. Even at European film festivals, Van Cleef positioned himself at the opposite end of any room Savalas entered. His cold stare delivered a message that needed no translation. Stay away. Savalas, for his part, never acknowledged the tension publicly. He continued to bask in the spotlight, collecting attention like currency, seemingly unbothered by one man's contempt. But those who knew both actors suspected that Savalas understood exactly how Van Cleef felt. He simply chose to ignore it. For Van Cleef, Savalas represented everything wrong with their profession: ego without discipline, flash without substance, the ability to steal focus while leaving true craftsmanship in the shadows. By the end of the decade, they had severed all contact, and Van Cleef never softened his stance. To him, Savalas wasn't just annoying, he was the embodiment of everything a professional actor should never be. Number 5. Yul Brynner, the ego that never quit. From the moment Lee Van Cleef first encountered Yul Brynner, he knew they would never get along. It was instinctive, visceral. Brynner walked into every room like he owned it, commanding attention with his polished bald head, perfect posture, and effortless charisma that came from decades of being treated like Hollywood royalty. Van Cleef saw it as arrogance on an industrial scale. The breaking point came at a film festival in Rome in 1967. Brynner, speaking to a crowd of journalists and industry insiders, dismissed European westerns with a single sneering remark. He called them amateur theaters for audiences who don't understand real cinema. He positioned American westerns as the only legitimate version of the genre, backed by real studios and serious money. Van Cleef was standing just meters away. He felt the insult like a physical blow. Here was a man who'd never crawled through the mud of low-budget productions, who'd never spent years playing unnamed villains just to keep working, who'd never faced the day-to-day struggle of proving his worth when an entire industry had written him off as washed up. And Brynner had the audacity to dismiss everything Van Cleef had fought for with a single contemptuous sentence? The feud escalated quickly. Producers, smelling profit, began developing a European Western that would pair them together. It should have been a guaranteed hit. Two iconic faces, both known for intensity and presence, brought together for the ultimate Western showdown? But Brynner refused the role outright. His reasoning, delivered through his agent and leaked back to Van Cleef, was devastating. He wouldn't share the screen with what he called a second-string gunslinger, a has-been, a character actor trying to play leads. Van Cleef took it as a declaration of war. He walked out of casting meetings. He refused to attend promotional events where Brynner might appear. And he told colleagues with barely contained fury that he didn't waste his time with men who confused ego for talent. The insult stung because it came from someone Van Cleef actually respected as an actor, even if he despised as a person. The insult cut deeper because of what it represented. Van Cleef's career was built on grind, on discipline, on showing up every single day and delivering authenticity even when Hollywood had written him off as finished. Brynner's success, in Van Cleef's eyes, came from luck and looks and the kind of studio backing that Van Cleef never received. At award ceremonies throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, the two men never exchanged a word. Van Cleef would sit at the far end of the room, his eyes fixed on Brynner with cold, unwavering contempt. Brynner would bask in the attention, delivering quips that drew laughs and applause, completely oblivious or completely indifferent to the hatred radiating from across the room. It was a masterclass in two different kinds of power. Brynner's was loud, performative, demanding recognition. Van Cleef's was silent, controlled, and infinitely more dangerous. They never reconciled, and when Brynner's name came up in conversation, Van Cleef's expression alone made his feelings clear.
Number 4. Charles Bronson, the betrayal that never healed. If you ask which feud hurt Lee Van Cleef the most, Charles Bronson's aim sits near the top. Because this wasn't about ego or showmanship or insults at a press conference. This was about loyalty, and about being replaced by someone Van Cleef considered a friend. It started in Italy during the early 1970s. Both men were in the running for lead roles in Sergio Leone's epic Once Upon a Time in the West. Van Cleef had worked closely with Leone on For a Few Dollars More and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. He'd helped define the visual language of Leone's films. He'd become the face of European westerns alongside Clint Eastwood. Naturally, he expected to headline Leone's next masterpiece. It was his turn. He'd earned it. Then Charles Bronson arrived. Tall, brooding, magnetic. Leone cast him instead. Van Cleef felt blindsided, humiliated, betrayed by the director who'd resurrected his career from the grave. The one man he'd trusted to keep investing in him felt like he was moving on to the next big thing. On set in Almeria, Spain, crew members recalled the tension like a storm front moving in. Every time Van Cleef and Bronson shared the same location, their eyes barely met. The air between them crackled with unspoken resentment. During breaks, Van Cleef was heard muttering to anyone who would listen. A block of granite could show more emotion than him. Bronson delivers nothing but a stare, and somehow Leone loves it. Bronson either didn't notice or didn't care. He moved through scenes with his trademark cold intensity, completely unbothered by Van Cleef's simmering rage. This infuriated Van Cleef even more. At least he could respect anger, but this indifference, it felt like erasure. The resentment grew over time. While Bronson's European fame soared, Van Cleef felt himself being pushed aside, reduced to second-tier productions he would have rejected just years earlier. The pecking order had shifted, and Van Cleef was no longer at the top. Producers began to notice Van Cleef's irritation and started staggering their schedules to avoid putting both men in the same space. On one occasion, a minor disagreement over props escalated into something more serious. Van Cleef stormed off the set, leaving Bronson standing there, untouched and calm. That single incident became symbolic of their entire relationship. Van Cleef burning with emotion, Bronson completely unmoved. Even in interviews years later, Van Cleef never held back his criticism. He questioned Bronson's training, his technique, his right to be elevated above actors who'd paid their dues in theater and method acting. Yet there was something else beneath the bitterness, a grudging recognition that audiences loved Bronson, that his minimalist approach worked, even if Van Cleef didn't respect it. The wound wasn't just about lost roles. It was about being passed over by someone who hadn't struggled the way Van Cleef had. It was about recognition that should have been his, going to someone else. By the late 1970s, the two men avoided each other entirely. Van Cleef never reconciled with the betrayal, and the Cold War between them persisted quietly until his death. Number 3. John Wayne, the Cowboy King he refused to acknowledge. John Wayne and Lee Van Cleef hated each other with a purity that shocked even the crews who witnessed it. This wasn't professional rivalry or creative disagreement. This was fundamental contempt between two men who represented completely different visions of what a Western hero should be. The spark came in 1965 on a studio lot in Los Angeles. Wayne, the all-American icon backed by John Ford and decades of patriotic westerns, strolled past a poster for a few dollars more. He reportedly loudly quipped to his entourage, making sure everyone within earshot could hear, "These Italians will never replace the real Western. Real Westerns are built on American values, American landscapes, and American actors." Van Cleef was standing nearby. He caught every word. His jaw tightened, his eyes narrowed into that trademark squint, and from that day forward, he refused to even acknowledge John Wayne's existence. To Wayne, European Westerns were cheap imitations, budget productions that lacked the grandeur and moral clarity of American cinema. He saw them as beneath him, unworthy of serious consideration. They were gimmicks, novelties. The Western, as filtered through a European sensibility, lacked the authenticity he'd spent decades perfecting. To Van Cleef, his dismissal was an insult to everything he'd built. Those Italian productions had resurrected his career when Hollywood had thrown him away. They'd given him leading roles after years of playing nameless villains. They'd made him a star when American studios saw him as washed up and unemployable. The tension escalated throughout the late 1960s as Van Cleef's reputation in Europe exploded. His films were making waves back in the States. Critics were starting to recognize the artistry in Leone's work, and Van Cleef's cold, dangerous presence was being celebrated as a new kind of Western anti-hero. Wayne, the symbol of old Hollywood morality, represented everything Van Cleef had rejected. Reports from Paramount insiders revealed that Van Cleef deliberately avoided Wayne at every studio event. They never exchanged a word, never shared a table, never appeared in a same photograph if Van Cleef could help it. Once, during a promotional dinner in 1967, a mutual colleague tried to introduce them. It was meant as a gesture of goodwill, an attempt to bridge the gap between American and European Western traditions. Van Cleef leaned back in his chair, stared at Wayne without blinking, and muttered just loud enough from nearby tables to hear, "I don't waste my time with mascots." Wayne noticed. He shrugged it off, chalking it up to the stiff arrogance of a foreign actor who didn't understand American cinema. But Van Cleef's contempt went deeper than professional disagreement. Wayne represented the establishment that had rejected him, the system that had typecast him as a villain for years, that had nearly destroyed him during his battle with alcoholism, that had written him off as finished. And then, when Van Cleef found success on his own terms in his own way, Wayne had the nerve to dismiss it as cheap Italian knockoffs. By the late 1970s, the distance between them was permanent. They never acted together, never spoke again. And according to European festival veterans, Van Cleef refused to sit at the same table as Wayne during any official gathering. His silent contempt for the Cowboy King became legendary among those who knew Hollywood's backstage battles. It wasn't just about Westerns, it was about respect, about acknowledging that different kinds of stories could be equally valid.
Number 2. Eli Wallach, the actor who got the glory. This entry might surprise you, because Eli Wallach was talented, respected, a serious actor with theater credentials, critical acclaim. But to Lee Van Cleef, Wallach represented something painful, the man who got the role that should have been his and reaped all the rewards Van Cleef had worked for. The film was The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Sergio Leone's masterpiece, the pinnacle of spaghetti western filmmaking, the film that would define an entire genre. Van Cleef played Angel Eyes, the bad. Clint Eastwood returned as the good, and Eli Wallach was cast as Tuco, the ugly. Here's what gnawed at Van Cleef. Tuco was the most complex character in the film, the most human, the one with dimension and humor and pathos, the role that gave an actor something to really work with. He was the emotional core of the story, the character audiences connected with, the one who made you care. Van Cleef was once again the stone-faced villain, menacing, dangerous, effective, but limited, a force of nature rather than a person. On set in Spain, the dynamic became clear. Eastwood was the star, the established name everyone came to see. Wallach was the revelation, the character actor stealing scenes left and right. And Van Cleef was the reliable heavy, doing exactly what was expected. Wallach's performance earned critical raves. Reviewers called Tuco the heart of the film, the character audiences remembered most vividly, the soul of the story. Van Cleef delivered his menace perfectly, but nobody wrote essays about Angel Eyes. Nobody discussed the depth of his character at dinner parties. His role was purposefully thin, designed to be an obstacle rather than a fully realized human being. The resentment wasn't about Wallach personally. By all accounts, he was professional and talented. But Van Cleef had spent years fighting to be taken seriously as a leading man. He'd finally gotten his break with Leone. And even in that breakthrough, he was still the one-dimensional villain, while someone else got the meaty role. During filming, Van Cleef kept his distance from Wallach, not hostile, but cold, professional, but never warm. He did his scenes, delivered his lines with that trademark intensity, and disappeared back to his trailer. Wallach later described the production as one of the highlights of his career. Van Cleef rarely talked about it except to discuss his working relationship with Leone. After the film's release, Wallach's career received a significant boost. Van Cleef's did too, but he watched as critics singled out Wallach's performance as something special. That's what hurt most. Not that Wallach had talent, but that once again, Van Cleef was the supporting player in his own story. Number 2.
Clint Eastwood, the partner who never looked back. When you ask which betrayal cut the deepest, there's only one answer: Clint Eastwood. Not because of any single incident, not because of a fight or an insult or a dramatic confrontation, but because of something worse: abandonment. They started as allies in 1965 on the sun-baked plains of Almeria, Spain, filming for a few dollars more. Van Cleef was the grizzled veteran, having spent years in Hollywood playing villains and bit parts. Eastwood was the rising American star with his quiet, deadly calm, fresh off a fistful of dollars. On camera, they were electric together, the perfect partnership. Two gunslingers with different codes but mutual respect. Their dynamic on screen felt authentic because the respect was real. Off camera, Van Cleef believed they were building something, a professional relationship that would continue, a friendship forged in the Spanish heat, a bond between two men who understood what it meant to work outside the Hollywood system. But once Eastwood returned to Hollywood, everything changed. The calls stopped coming. The opportunities Van Cleef expected never materialized. Eastwood's career exploded into the stratosphere. Van Cleef remained stuck in European productions, unable to translate his overseas success back to American cinema. In interviews decades later, Van Cleef's bitterness was barely concealed. He admitted bluntly that Eastwood had gone Hollywood, that he didn't care who stood beside him when he started, that he used the people who helped him and discarded them once he didn't need them anymore. That single line reveals everything. The man who helped make Eastwood a global star felt left in the shadows. By 1973, Eastwood had started directing his own films: High Plains Drifter, The Outlaw Josie Wales, Unforgiven. These were perfect opportunities for Van Cleef to re-enter the American Western scene. The roles were there, the projects fit his strengths perfectly. But the calls never came. Van Cleef reached out to Malpaso Productions, Eastwood's company. He sent letters, made inquiries, hoped for roles. His letters were quietly ignored. Veterans in Rome recall that when the two briefly crossed paths at European festivals, Eastwood nodded politely. He smiled. He exchanged pleasantries, but he offered nothing beyond empty gestures. It was a slow, burning betrayal, not dramatic enough to make headlines, not public enough to create scandal. Just a gradual realization that the partnership Van Cleef thought they'd built meant nothing once Eastwood didn't need him anymore. Van Cleef watched the young American ride to superstardom, while his own fame, built entirely on European spaghetti westerns, never translated back home the way he'd hoped. He never publicly attacked Eastwood. That wasn't his style. But crew members whispered that Van Cleef would mutter about being used and discarded, about climbing mountains together only to be left behind once the summit was reached. After for a few dollars more and the good, the bad, and the ugly, they never worked together again. Their friendship, if it ever really existed, never recovered. The protege had become the betrayer, and the grudge stayed frozen in time until Van Cleef's death in 1989. That's why Clint Eastwood sits at number one, not because of hatred, but because of something more painful: disappointment. The realization that in Hollywood, loyalty is a commodity that evaporates the moment it's no longer profitable. So there you have it, 6 feuds that defined the darker side of Lee Van Cleef's career, from the showboats he couldn't tolerate to the partner who left him behind, from ego clashes to professional betrayals that cut deeper than any gunfight on screen. These weren't the stories Hollywood tells. These weren't the sanitized narratives we see in biographies. These were the raw, bitter truths about ambition, respect, and the price of success in an industry that chews people up and spits them out. Lee Van Cleef built an incredible career. He became a legend, but he also carried these grudges like stones in his pockets, weighing him down, reminding him of every slight, every betrayal, every moment when he felt less than. Which story shocked you the most? Was it the Cold War with Charles Bronson, the mutual contempt with John Wayne, or the painful reality that even Clint Eastwood, his partner in cinema history, walked away when Hollywood called? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories about Western legends, the battles they fought behind the cameras, and the grudges that lasted lifetimes,
Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell. Because the real West was never as simple as good guys and bad guys, and neither was Lee Van Cleef. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.